do have Christian's Lexus here that you've probably seen before. It's the all-wheel drive one with the Turbo 400. So we're going to give a rundown on what it takes to build this, and we'll go for a drive in it.
This is my 2004 IS300, naturally aspirated 2JZ GE VVTi, basically the standard engine that comes in these. It's got a set of forged pistons, a set of Wiseco's with HD pins. It's got some spool Pro Drag I-beam rods, standard crankshaft, standard all-wheel drive oil pump, the thin single layer head gasket, so the 0.3mm one that suits the head, a set of...
and so what compression ratio is it?
This one's about 9.5.
Okay.
And it's got...
And it's on the E85.
Yeah, E85. Well, actually it's full flex. The flex tune turns the boost up and does a lot of other things as well, but yeah, so it runs about 28 pounds of boost on E85 and about 14 pounds of boost on pump fuel. Turbo's a Garrett GDX 4202, so 76mm compressor, 75mm turbine. It's got a divided 1.15 turbine housing on it. It's got Brian Crower 276 stage 3 plus cams in it and valve springs. It's got EGTs in each of the exhaust manifolds I use for diagnostics. My computer's not capable of reading that live data, so I just read it off a handheld device. Nitrous maybe, I'm part way through doing that. It doesn't really need it as a roll-on at the moment, but it'll probably need it to get it on the trans brake, because it is pretty lazy to get up there. Fuel pressure regulator with fuel pressure compensation off that sensor in the side of the rig there. It's got a set of 1450cc injectors running 4-bar base fuel pressure, so that puts them up around the 1700. And
that's a standard rail?
Yep, standard GE rail with some fittings welded in.
Because they're top feed in these factory.
Yeah. Yep, and yeah, the intake manifold's just a GE one. I cut the top off with the bandsaw and we welded on a 3.5-inch pipe, put a bit of a scallop in it to clear the bonnet, and welded a flange on and used a 2JZ GTE VVTi throttle body. Intercooler piping's all stainless steel 3-inch. I've got an ETS Evo 9 wide tank intercooler that I got ETS to put 3-inch in and outs on it instead of the 2.5s that they come with. So it is 90mm thick, and they claim they've made 1,000 horsepower on them, so that's basically the biggest core that I could fit in without having to cut anything up too much. Still got the standard cooler, the AC condenser, power steering, yeah, all this stuff's still in there, so it's still...
And that's your trans cooler?
Yep, although for the trans cooler, the biggest one that I could fit in. Just a basic catch can. I mean, this engine doesn't breathe very much, but it's just got a separator with some steel wool and a couple of baffles in there, nothing too flash. Obviously Turbo 400's got a dipstick at the back there. It's just a custom DIY job, 3.5-inch exhaust from the turbo back, a couple of DeFilippo mufflers and a resonator up the front.
And how big of a dump pipe?
3.5, and wastegate to atmosphere. Diff is a stock IS300. It's one of the 200mm, basically Hilux kind of things. It's a 3.73 ratio, and it's got a MA70 Supra.
Which is like an 80s Supra.
Yeah, plate type LSD in it, but I've had shimmed and new frictions and everything in it, so that locks up pretty good. Just got some lowered king springs in the back. I've got some rose jointed toe arms to stop the toe from changing under acceleration. Also just a basic little camber kit to get some of the geometry back.
And then the subframe?
Subframe's all IS300, just got some locking collars on there.
And what do they do?
It takes all the compliance out of the rubber bushes.
Yeah, okay, right.
So it locks them up to nearly solid, but not solid.
And RSRs all around?
Yep. Vogue Racing RE30s with 235 4018 RSRs. RSRs, I think these ones are.
What's the extra R for?
That's probably just extra racy. It's twice as racy as the R's. If we go on to the factory rear section of the tail shaft, and then I got to get the front section of the tail shaft remade. It's out of Dom tubing. So yeah, still running a donut. This is a Ford Territory BMW X5, same thing, NV125 transfer case. Those with territories will notice I've chopped off the big hideous rubber mount that goes there. What I did, I made up a plate out of 6mm steel. I got the Turbo 400 output shaft resplined to suit the input of the transfer case, and I've got a shackle bush mount there with a custom cross member. I've got the prop shaft that goes to the front wheels. The rear section is Ford Territory. The front section is Toyota Crown i4.
Don't worry about the aircon.
Yeah, a bit of aircon water there. So the gearbox is a 3-speed, full manualised, fully built trans brake Turbo 400. It's got a ATF speed plate, CNC billet plate on the front that converts it to the J3 Super bell housing. And it's got a custom TCE 6000 RPM torque converter in there. Now the transmission's just the usual kind of build, full manual, reverse pattern, trans brake, extra frictions, asbestos linings, 300M input shaft, that sort of stuff. When I did the all-wheel drive conversion, we actually bought a running driving Toyota Crown i4 in Japan, and I had a guy over there cut it in half and send me the front half of the car and also the rear subframe and everything, which I didn't end up needing. Yeah, so the front subframe is all Toyota Crown i4. So basically what you need is the subframe, because it splits it to 2 subframes. The
and makes it a mid-sump then? That would be then mid-sump?
That would be the mid-sump, yeah. So you've got the front cross member and the rear one that the steering rack mounts to. That's about all that mounts to here. And you have to change these box section that goes on the chassis there, because it doesn't have these bolts, because the rear-wheel drive ones don't use this. I had a pretty good idea that the JZS Crown subframes would be workable, because IS300s and JZS and JZX in rear-wheel drive form all use the same front subframe. So I knew that the chassis rails would be the right distance apart, and then it would just be a case of matching it up front to rear. So I took some measurements, and I had to drill and weld in some crush sleeves into the chassis rails to put the through bolts in to mount the subframe too. On the front you can see the differential bolts on this side of the lower oil pan. So the pan on the all-wheel drive car is just this small section. The aluminium section goes all the way up. They also use a special oil pump that has the pickup come straight out the bottom of the oil pump rather than going through the side of the block. So the pickup comes straight out the bottom of the oil pump and runs inside the pan down into the lower section where it picks up the oil from. Everything is completely standard. 3.73. I got these cars, when they come from Japan, they're a 4.3 ratio, and I tracked down a 3.73 front diff out of a later model all-wheel drive US market Lexus. So it looked close enough, so I took a punt, and when it got here, although it was different on the outside because it was bolted up to a V6, all the internals were the same. Yes, so I was able to get that conversion working. So
it was out of an IS350, all-wheel drive IS350?
It was an IS or a GS, I'm not sure which one it was.
Yeah, okay.
I just eBay searched 3.73 Lexus front diff,
yeah,
and bought the cheapest one that was there. Everything here is all standard Toyota, everything in the front's all standard Toyota stuff. Struts are standard Toyota, just with the sort of lowered king springs. Nothing really flash in there.
And what brakes?
These are Supra rotors with Lexus calipers. Now, all I did was space the Lexus calipers out. What you can do is you can take the mounting slide bracket and swap it left to right, and the top bolt lines up, and you just have to make a 30mm spacer for the bottom bolt. So it's really quite simple to just space out your Lexus calipers onto a 326mm rotor. If you swap this bracket here from left to right, the top bolt goes in standard, and then just because of the offset of the way the bracket works, you can just, yeah, I think it was 30mm center to center, and the swept area on the pad touches right on the edge of the rotor exactly as it should.
So you bought that?
No, I actually had some old conrods laying around, and I got it laser cut out of an old conrod, so it's 4340 forged steel.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so it's nothing really special. It's just got a 320 litre per hour lift pump in the tank, and a pair of Raceflow or Raceworks
ProFlow.
One of those.
Just 040 rip-offs basically.
040 rip-offs, the 380 litre per hours. One's full-time, one's staged, and an Aeroflow Sheepy, one of the underslung undercar surge tanks, and I hard piped everything. Back when it was deadhead, I used to have the fuel pressure reg back here, hence the loop that's up the front side there. I only use a dash 8 feed and a dash 6 return. The dash 8 feed comes up to this point, goes through the dash 8 filter, and goes up this way where I split the dash 8 to a pair of dash 6s and run it to either end of the standard GE fuel rail, and have the regulator coming out the centre of the rail down the dash 6 into the return. Obviously the flex sensors in the return line.
And a little bit of relieving of the transmission tunnel here.
Yeah, what I did is I cut out the section. The Crown uses an A340 and it has a section that's much shorter. So what I did is I cut out the section out of the half cut and then massaged it and extended it where it needed to be so that it lined up correctly with this. So basically the Crown section started about here and goes all the way back down to about there where I split it. And then I added in 4 inches of just sheet metal, and then I continued with the other Crown section. You can see the welders up in there. I looked for the cheapest one I could find on car sales because I planned on cutting it up, and then whether that was to wide body the rear to get some tyres under it or to go all-wheel drive. And I basically built the car and it was making good horsepower based on sort of injector duty calculations. It was around 900, but you couldn't hook it up because Lexuses, or these in particular with 2JZs, are very nose heavy and it's really hard to get the weight to transfer. So I cracked some main caps in that engine, and then when that happened I decided it was all-wheel drive time, and here we are.
And you've always had all-wheel drive, you had Subarus?
Correct, yeah, I've always had Subarus. I had a reasonably fast Evo, and yeah, I originally wanted the smallest car that came with a 2JZ, and I'd always planned on putting a Turbo 400 in it, but yeah, just had to keep the options open for all-wheel drive. Now when I put the all-wheel drive in, yeah, I was going to do the A340, but at that time they didn't have any really good A340s available, so I had to come up with a solution which was an all-wheel drive Turbo 400. They come out in other vehicles in America, but the transfer cases are way too big for what I needed to do, so I used an SUV that's available in the Australian market, and these transfer cases come out in Territories, which are a Barra engine, and they last pretty well in those, so I thought that might be an option. And the input shaft was smaller than the Turbo 400 output shaft, which meant that it could be reduced in size and resplined.
There's no hesitation, eh?
It's just on and gone.
Yeah. Now you can get a good A340. Would you still have done the Turbo 400?
For an outright race car, the Turbo 400 is still a better option. But if you wanted to have a street car, probably one of the good stage 3 A340s that still retains the lock-up converter and the overdrive gears would be a better thing. But they're saying that I don't take this out on the highway, and certainly belting it around town is no problem, so I'm not about to go changing this. I think it's better for what I use it for. But if you wanted a daily that could do everything, like to drive to work every day, probably the A340 option's a better option.